Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to look at Chapter 24, Part 1, The Conquest of the Americas. Or was it? Well, let's take a look. So, by the end of this history bite, you should be able to answer these essential questions. How did Europeans manage to topple the major empires of the Americas? How did Native Americans resist the increasing military pressure from Europeans? Among other questions, you should definitely be able to answer those two. So let's talk about the quick notable conquests that have occurred and are usually retold when we discuss the subjugation of the Americas. So Columbus lands on Hispaniola in 1492 and sets up some colonies in the Caribbean, which eventually grow into Cuba, among others. In 1519, a little over 20 years after Columbus lands, Hernan Cortez leads an expedition against the Aztec Empire, which occupied central Mexico. And he captured the Aztec capital and its ruler, Montezuma. Now, eventually he would be driven off, but he would come back 2 years later with a much larger army, capture the capital again, and kill the ruling class in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. You also have if I'm remembering correctly, a distant relative of Hernan Cortez, Francisco Pizarron, leading a similar expedition into the Andes Mountains of South America with about 180 soldiers, where through a combination of sheer luck and boldness, they managed to capture and later executed the Incan emperor, even though they super duper promised they wouldn't kill him if he gave them a bunch of gold. They later killed him anyway. You also had Ponce de Leon, who led an expedition to Florida, ostensibly to find the Fountain of Youth, but he ended up helping establish one of the first permanent settlements in what is now the United States at St. Augustine, Florida. You also have Hernando de Soto, who led an expedition through Mississippi and was probably the first European to really explore the interior of what is now the United States. And in 1494, you have one of the most interesting things ever to happen. You have the Treaty of Tordesillas, in which Spain and Portugal divided the world. And the Pope said who got which half. Now, all this sounds really cool and really great, but this leads to some interesting questions. How effective was this conquest? And how much of it was European? Well, one of the things to keep in mind is that the Spanish, especially when it came to fighting against the Aztecs, they relied on non-native Aztec tribes to assist them. So people that the Aztecs had been ruling over, like an oppressing power, who didn't like the Aztecs, who joined with the Spanish to overthrow the Aztecs, formed about 95% of the soldiers who fought against the Aztecs. In particular, one person named Malinche, or sometimes called Donna Maria, was this Native American noblewoman who was related to a group that was opposing the Aztecs, and she assisted Cortez. She was a translator. She helped him navigate the cultural world of the Americas, and she later married him and had 3 children by him. But she's really famous. Without her, the conquest would probably not have gone the way it was. And as you can imagine, she's got a bit of a mixed reputation in contemporary Mexico. The Incan Empire had just come off of a civil war, and their leader Atahualpa was not universally loved by all of these Incan subjects, right? And part of that civil war had been sparked when a series of diseases ravaged the ruling class of the Incan Empire and killed their existing monarch, hence Atahualpa coming to power just after a civil war from this question of succession. So, you know, the Spanish were really helped along by a lot of non-European natives and non-Aztec natives. They were assisted by political infighting within these empires. And it's not like these conquests were ever solid all the time. So both Ponce de Leon and Hernando de Soto were chased off or killed by natives who were not happy to see them. Ponce de Leon was killed, and Hernando de Soto was injured and later died of that injury during their expedition. So it wasn't like all these conquests were complete or 100% solidified all the time. It's something to keep in mind. And then there was just straight up resistance, which almost immediately rose up. The Inca resisted almost immediately after the capture and execution of their emperor. As well as later Native Americans in what is now Peru would take the mantle of the Incan emperor, such as Tupac Amaru, when he revolted in 1781. But there were a number of small rebellions, such as Pope's Rebellion, which drove the Spanish out of New Mexico. Now, to be fair, there were not actually that many Spanish in New Mexico to begin with, but the efforts of the Spanish to Christianize the Pueblo peoples, the peoples of New Mexico, what is now New Mexico and Arizona and parts of northern Mexico, really angered a lot of them. And a man named Pope led the rebellion. They killed the Spanish priests and drove out the Spanish soldiers, and they went back to worshiping their own gods for about 2 decades until the Spanish came back with an army and put them down. In Chile, there were a group called the Mapuche Indians who led a campaign of resistance for about 300 years. Lautaro was a famous Mapuche leader who allegedly, when he had his hand severed, when he was captured and had one of his hands severed as punishment for rebellion, legends has it that he tied a blade onto his hand and then continued to fight against the Spanish for a number of years until he was captured. And this time, instead of removing his hands, they removed his head to prevent rebellion. But nonetheless, the Mapuche continued to fight the Spanish and would only be crushed by an independent Chilean government after the Chilean Wars of Independence. In the Yucatan Peninsula, the Mayan Indians simply moved further away from the Spanish, and some of them didn't even accept Christianity for almost 200 years after the arrival of the Spanish. So resistance isn't always a violent uprising. It can sometimes just be moving away from the Spanish and maintaining your way of life. Tupac Amaru is one of the more famous examples of revolting. This occurred in 1781. During the what we might call the Age of Liberty, during the time of the American Revolution was occurring as well. And in his case, he led Native Americans in an uprising against the Europeans. And so this wasn't a revolt of like Europeans against an oppressive government. This was a revolt of Native Americans against Europeans. So there was a lot of resistance. There was resistance in the beginning, and there continued to be resistance right up until the independence of these colonies. But we'll talk more about that when we get there. So here is a mural of Lautaro, the Mapuche leader. This is somewhere in Chile, I believe. And this is an Aztec painting, actually, of Malinche and Cortez talking with other Native American nobles. So now that the Spanish ruled over these large chunks of what is now North and South America, how did they seek to hold it? Well, they did what the Roman Empire had actually done, and they gave land to soldiers and sometimes fortune seekers. These lands, these grants of lands were sometimes called haciendas or encomiendas, and this system lasted for about 100 years after the initial arrival of the Spanish. And basically, in return for a grant of land, that could be very, very large, the fortune seeker or the soldier would get the Indians to work as his laborers, but he also was supposed to Christianize them. He was supposed to protect them from other settlers who might not seek to Christianize them. In reality, this almost never happened, or it was so blasé that it didn't really work. And many natives, even though officially accepted Christianity, there was some report I remember reading where they said that most natives didn't even know how to make the sign of the cross. They said they were Christian, but they didn't really know what that meant. The encomienda and the hacienda were replaced by the repartimento, which was a system very similar, where natives were still required to give a certain section of labor, but now it was not tied to specific land. They just had to give labor in general to whoever was living on their land. And the thing about the Spanish administration is that it relied a lot of these systems, especially in places that the Spanish did not have like an ironclad grip on, like outside of central Mexico and outside of the high Andes, required local tribal leaders to bring people under their controls. The Spanish had to work with existing tribal elites, for example, in the mission system in California and Florida, to get natives to come live in the missions. And in the Mita system, which was a system in South America where everybody did a little bit of labor for a certain number of months out of the year, horrendous, horrifying labor, which we'll talk about in a bit, this required local elites to convince natives to go work for the Spanish. So even in places where the Spanish rule seemed solid, it did really rely on local elites. And this is a trend that we will see again when we talk about European control over Africa. It is interesting, though, that within the Spanish administration, there were those who critiqued this system of sort of subjugating Native Americans. Bartholomew de las Casas was a priest who argued that the Spanish were committing a grave evil by enslaving and brutalizing Native Americans. And it's worth noting that there was actually a debate that went on in Europe from like 1500 until 1550, which essentially argued that did Native Americans have souls? Were they humans or were they spawns of Satan? Remember what I said back in chapter 23 is that there was nothing in the Bible or any of the ancient traditions Europeans were familiar with that told them about the Americas. And so there was this actual debate about whether Native Americans had souls and were humans. In the end, the Pope ruled, in fact, that they were humans, didn't stop them from being enslaved. But it's really interesting that this is actually one of the first debates about human rights in history, was questioning whether Native Americans were, in fact, human. And even though they ruled that they were, it didn't stop the enslavement or the abuse. So, one step forward, two steps back kind of thing. Now, the English and the French, unlike the Spanish, did not manage to create huge, vast empires. There were no more real Native American empires to topple. Those super dense settlements, which I think I talked about in chapter 20, did not exist in North America outside of the Mississippi Valley, but they had collapsed by the time the Europeans arrived. And so the English centered their concentrations, their populations around the Hudson Bay and the modern East Coast. And this was all about trading. The Hudson Bay in particular was all about fur trading, and Jamestown, while initially they thought they were going to dig up a bunch of gold, they ended up just growing tobacco. And so this was a cash crop industry. Later on, some of the East Coast would develop what we might call industry, like especially Pennsylvania and New York would create, like, you'd have small scale manufacturing. But initially it was just about making money for the crown. And while the relationships with the indigenous people were initially somewhat friendly, you might be thinking of the first Thanksgiving, it quickly turned quite sour. In fact, most people don't realize the first Thanksgiving actually commemorated a massacre of Pequot Indians, where the Pilgrims gave thanks that God had allowed them to successfully massacre these heathens. The actual day of Thanksgiving was not called the Day of Thanksgiving. We call it that now, but that's only something we've done since the 1860s, when it was created to unify the country after the American Civil War. So I mentioned the Pequot Wars. There's also King Philip's War. Both of these wars were brutal and bloody, and they just sort of indicated the level of conflict between the English settlers and the natives. With the exception of like William Penn in the colony of Pennsylvania, pretty much every other English colony was just all about pretty much taking land. If they thought it was theirs, if they thought it was empty, they would go in and take it. And, the natives be darned. That doesn't concern us. This kind of goes back to what I was talking about John Locke's natural rights. The right of taking land if it's not being used. That's kind of how a lot of colonists sort of looked at the natives. They don't know how to use the land, therefore it's ours to take if we want it. French settlements were a little different. So the French focused more on Mississippi and other parts of Canada. Just like the English, they focused on trading and particularly for fur, along with some other smaller resources. But the French couldn't really get a lot of people to come to New France because unlike the English colonies, where you could go there potentially for free if you wanted to, and it was, at least in some colonies, an opportunity to escape. The French colonies were heavily regulated by the crown, and only certain people were allowed to go, and some people were sent there, and they found that it was just like France itself, right? You were a peasant, you were still a peasant when you got to New France. So not a lot of people went, mostly fur traders. And in part because of the smaller settlement meant that they couldn't kind of go willy-nilly try to wipe out the natives like the English or the Spanish would try to. In fact, the French were notably defeated in several engagements they had with the natives. The Oneida conflict of 1615, the French were resoundingly defeated by the Oneida Indians, which are a group that I believe they lived around what is now the Great Lakes. Most the people that came to the French colonies were young males who sought to be fur traders. And so what they would do is they'd go out into the wilderness and they would make alliances with the native peoples. In particular, they may try to ingratiate themselves into a native tribe by marrying like the daughter of a chief or another indigenous woman who could help them do business and do trade with the native groups. This might kind of remind you a little bit of those diasporic communities in the Indian Ocean basin. This created a somewhat unique culture in Canada called the Metis, which stands for, I believe it stands for mixed. And so French Canada was unique in that it, in some ways, was much more tolerant and friendly with natives than Spanish or Americans were. Or sorry, English. I say Spanish or the English. But that said, it's really important not to forget that even though one European group in particular might have been like friendly to the natives, all of them were there to colonize the land, and all of them were there to take resources, and all of them were there ostensibly to strengthen their own countries. They were not there to empower the natives. That's something that sometimes gets lost in the discussion of like which European group was more friendly to the natives, right? It doesn't really matter. They were all kind of there to colonize. So it's worth keeping that in mind. This is normally the map we see of the colonies of the Americas, right? The political boundaries, the friendship here in Mississippi and parts of Canada, the Hudson Bay for the English, the East Coast for the English, the green being the large Spanish Empire, and the purple, this orange being the Portuguese. But a better map of the Americas might be this one, which you'll have to look at it on your own and zoom in. This is a map of the tribal cultures as they existed in 1492, based on research, oral histories, and estimated population locations. But it's really important to remember that, you know, the history of the conquest of the Americas doesn't begin with this map. This is the end. This is the beginning, right? The natives that were here first were the beginning of this story. So it's important to keep that in mind. Remember how I said the Spanish and the Portuguese divided up the world? Well, this is the map of how it supposedly went down, even though nobody knew that Australia existed at the time, right? You have the Portuguese who got the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic, and then you have the Spanish who got all of the Pacific and part of the Caribbean and the North Atlantic. So, and if you think this held up for even like a little bit in the minds of any other European power, no, it did not. And even the Spanish didn't really quite understand it because they established the Philippines, which is supposed to be very clearly in the Portuguese territory. So funny how that goes. Anyhow, you should be able to answer the first two questions from the beginning of this history bite. I want to thank you for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I will see you next time.